The case file was already 3 weeks old when I opened it, which meant whoever had hired me was either very patient or very afraid to move faster. I've been a private investigator for 11 years. Before that, I did skip tracing for a bail bondsman in the Pacific Northwest, which means I spent a long time finding people who didn't want to be found. Most of the time, those people were just broke. Occasionally, they were something worse. The point is, I'm not someone who spooks easily, and I'm not someone who tells stories about my work. This is the first time I've broken that rule. I'm breaking it 3 times over because I think the details matter, and I think some of you might recognize something in here. These are 3 cases. The second one is the one that still wakes me up. I'll get to that. The first case came through a referral from a family law attorney I'd worked with before. Her name was Deborah. She called me on a Thursday afternoon and said she had a client who needed documentation on a private organization, a social club, she called it, that her client's adult daughter had recently joined. The daughter wasn't in danger, Deborah said. The mother just wanted to understand what she'd gotten into. I took the meeting. The mother was a woman in her late 50s named Carol. She wore the kind of clothes that take effort to look effortless, and she sat with her hands folded the way people do when they're trying not to show that their hands are shaking. She told me her daughter had joined something called the Meridian Circle about 8 months prior. They described themselves publicly as a personal development and networking organization. Membership was invitation only. Dues were substantial. Carol mentioned a figure in the low 5 figures for the first year, but her daughter had money of her own from a trust, so Carol hadn't been able to stop it. What bothered Carol wasn't the money, it was a change she'd noticed in her daughter. The daughter, her name was Lydia, had always been close with Carol. They spoke on the phone several times a week. In the months since joining Meridian, Lydia had gone from calling Carol daily to calling once every 2 weeks. When they did speak, Lydia sounded fine, upbeat even, but she deflected questions the way you'd deflect a conversation you'd been coached to manage. I told Carol I'd take a look. Standard surveillance work, public records, social media, nothing invasive, nothing that would constitute harassment. She agreed. What I found in the first week was almost nothing, which was itself a finding. The Meridian Circle had essentially no online footprint, no reviews, no forum discussions, no mention on any of the personal development subreddits or message boards I knew. That's unusual. Even moderately obscure organizations leave traces. Someone who's grateful, someone who's angry, someone who joins and then posts about it. The absence of all of that takes effort. I found a business registration in Delaware and a physical address in a mid-sized city about 2 hours from Carol's home. The registered agent was a law firm. The listed officers changed every 2 years, which is legal but notable. It makes continuous documentation difficult. I did a pass by the physical address, which was a converted Victorian house in a wealthy residential neighborhood. Nice block, the kind of street where every house has a security system and neighbors notice unfamiliar cars. I didn't park. I drove through twice and noted that the building had no signage whatsoever, a fact that seemed inconsistent with an organization that claimed to welcome new members. The second week, I got lucky. I found a woman on a private Facebook group for cult recovery who'd been a member 3 years prior. I reached out. She agreed to talk on the phone once. She told me that Meridian ran on a tiered membership structure. You entered at the foundation level, which involved monthly meetings, a reading list, and what she called reflection exercises. Journaling prompts, essentially, that you shared with a senior member called a steward. The prompts weren't unusual at first. What did you want from your career? What relationships in your life created friction? Standard coaching territory, but they accumulated. Over months, your steward built up a detailed picture of your vulnerabilities, your estrangements, your fears. The woman on the phone didn't use the word leverage, but she described a meeting where her steward had referenced something she'd written in her journal, something private, as a reason she shouldn't leave the organization. That's leverage. She left anyway. She said leaving was easier for her than for others because she didn't have family members in the organization. Some members did. Recruiting a family member moved you up a tier. I documented everything she told me with her permission. I brought it back to Carol. Carol listened and then sat quietly for a moment. She said, "Is my daughter in danger?" I told her I didn't think Lydia was in physical danger. The organization appeared to be financially exploitative and psychologically manipulative, but it wasn't violent. The danger was the slow type, the kind that costs you your relationships and your savings and several years before you fully understand what happened. Carol asked me what she should do. I told her that was a question for a therapist who specialized in high control groups, not a PI. I gave her 2 names. She thanked me. I found out 2 months later, through Deborah, that Lydia had left the organization on her own. Something had happened internally, a falling out at a senior level, and several members had exited at once. I don't know what the falling out was about. I didn't ask. The thing that stays with me about that case isn't the manipulation structure, which was textbook once you saw it. It's the fact that the organization's power came almost entirely from information. The journaling prompts, the one-on-one steward relationships. Nobody was forced to share anything. They shared willingly because the environment made sharing feel like growth. The steward never threatened. The steward just remembered, and remembered, and remembered. And eventually, when you wanted to leave, you felt watched even when no one was in the room. I've thought about that a lot since then. The second case is the one I said wakes me up. I need to be specific about something before I start. I'm not going to use the real name of the organization, the city, or the individuals involved. I'm going to change enough details that the people in this story, including me, cannot be identified. What I will not change is the sequence of events or the final discovery, because that's the part I need people to understand. I was hired by a man I'll call Richard. He was in his mid-40s, fit in the way that wealthy men can afford to be, and he came to me through a corporate investigative firm I'd done subcontract work for. He needed documentation on a private club, I'll call it the Harwick Society, that a business partner of his had recently joined. He framed it as due diligence. He wanted to know if the organization had any legal exposure that might affect his partner's professional reputation. It was a reasonable request. I'd done that kind of work before. The Harwick Society was easier to find information on than Meridian had been, but only because it was older. It had been operating in some form since the 1970s, originally as a men's professional networking club. Over the decades, it had evolved, or, depending on how you looked at it, accumulated. The membership was old money and new money both. The kind of people who get buildings named after them. The annual retreat was held at a private estate outside the city, and it had a reputation for being thorough. 4 days, structured programming, significant cost per attendee. The first thing I noticed was that the retreat was photographed. That was unusual. Organizations like this typically control their image carefully. They don't let attendees document the gatherings, but there were photographs on a members-only area of the website, which I'd accessed through credentials that Richard provided me. He was a provisional member himself. That was how he knew the partner had joined. The photographs looked like any corporate retreat. Meals together, keynote sessions, a fire pit gathering that could have been a company offsite at any upscale venue. The people in the photographs looked relaxed. They were dressed well. Nobody looked afraid. I kept that image in my mind because it became important later. Over the first 2 weeks, I documented the organizational structure, the leadership, the financial filings, nothing obviously illegal. The society was registered as a private club under a section of the tax code that gave it significant latitude regarding membership and activities. Dues were high, but not extraordinary for this demographic. I found 2 former members willing to talk, both of whom said they'd left for mundane reasons, relocated, career change, lost interest. Neither described anything alarming. I was beginning to think this was a straightforward vetting job. Organizations like this are often less interesting than they appear. Rich people gathering to network and feel exclusive is a billion-dollar industry. It's not criminal. Then Richard called me and changed the parameters. He said he'd received a message from his partner, I'll call him Marcus, that had struck him as odd. Marcus had been at the annual retreat for 2 days. The message was brief, sent via text, and it said, "Richard, I want you to know that I've been thinking about our disagreement over the Hendricks contract, and I understand your position better now. Looking forward to continued partnership." Richard read this to me over the phone. Then he said, "We've never had a disagreement over a Hendricks contract. There is no Hendricks contract. I have no idea what he's talking about." I asked if Marcus sometimes got confused, made mistakes. Richard said, no. Marcus was careful with language. He didn't send text like that. I asked if this could be something benign, a typo, wrong recipient. Richard said he'd considered that, but the text had his name at the start. It wasn't misdirected. Marcus had addressed it to him specifically. He asked me to look harder. I spent the next week going back through everything I'd already found, looking at it differently, the photographs on the members' website, The retreat structure. I found the programming schedule for the retreat in a document Richard forwarded. He'd received it when Marcus shared his itinerary. 4 days. I mapped the hours. The schedule was dense. Sessions from 7 in the morning until 10 at night. Meals were communal and structured. No free dining. You ate with your assigned table. Sleep time was technically there, but when I calculated it against the session schedule, the actual sleep window was about 5 hours per night. There were listed activities called integration practices which occurred at the end of each evening and at the start of each morning. Nothing explained what integration practices were. 5 hours of sleep over 4 days with a packed schedule and no unstructured time is not a conference. It's a controlled environment. Sleep deprivation at that level, sustained over multiple days, has measurable cognitive effects. Decision-making degrades. Susceptibility to suggestion increases. This is documented in research. It's also documented in studies of high control group induction techniques. I wrote this up and sat with it. The text message, the apologizing for a conflict that hadn't happened, the endorsement of a position that didn't exist. These are things people do when they've been prepared to do them, when the environment has softened their resistance enough that they'll reach out and smooth things over with important relationships on schedule. I needed to understand what on schedule meant. I found one other former member who hadn't appeared in my initial research, a woman who'd been a member for 3 years before leaving. She agreed to meet me in person. She was composed, but she chose a coffee shop that faced the street with good sight lines, and she sat with her back to the wall, which I noticed. She told me the integration practices were essentially confession and affirmation sessions. Each attendee had an assigned facilitator, a senior member. In the morning, you reported to your facilitator what you dreamed about, what you were thinking about when you woke up, what you intended for the day. In the evening, you reported what had shifted in your thinking since the morning session. The facilitator guided the conversation. Over 4 days, a skilled facilitator could walk someone through what she described as a reorientation, a restructuring of how you thought about your relationships, your professional decisions, your goals. I asked her what reorientation felt like from the inside. She said, "It felt like finally thinking clearly." She said that slowly, the way you repeat something that used to feel true. I asked her what triggered the text message sequences because she confirmed they happened, that reaching out to smooth professional relationships was something attendees were guided to do on the 3rd day. She said the facilitators framed it as practicing the new clarity you'd achieved. Reaching out was proof that the reorientation had worked. She left the society when a close friend of hers came back from a retreat and apologized to her for things he'd said years before, things she'd never experienced, and things he didn't seem to fully remember, describing when she asked for specifics. I have been in this work for 11 years and I've seen a lot of manipulation. Most of it is clumsy, most of it relies on obvious levers: greed, fear, flattery. What I was looking at was something different. It was manipulation as a craft. Patient, refined, wearing a tailored suit and offering you a glass of very good wine. The scariest part was that almost everyone inside it would have defended it. The techniques had no visible fingerprints because the person being changed was the one describing their own transformation in glowing terms. I brought everything to Richard. Documented. Organized. I recommended he contact Marcus directly. Not about the retreat, just a normal conversation, to assess where Marcus's thinking was. I suggested he consult with a deprogramming specialist if Marcus seemed significantly altered. Richard thanked me. He paid the invoice. He called me once more, about 6 weeks later. He said he'd had lunch with Marcus. Marcus seemed mostly like himself. There was a quality to the conversation, a kind of smooth agreeableness, a resistance to any real disagreement that hadn't been there before. But Marcus was functional, still the same person in most ways. I asked what Richard intended to do with the information. He said he wasn't sure. He said some of the men involved were people you did not create problems for carelessly. I said I understood. What I didn't say was that the phrase "people you do not create problems for carelessly" had stayed with me. Because the thing about the Harwick Society, the thing that made it different from the first case, was the membership. This wasn't a personal development organization targeting ambitious young professionals. This was a network of people who ran things. Actual things. Institutions, industries, and if the techniques I documented were being applied at a retreat that happened every year to a rotating membership of highly influential people, I sat with the math on that for a long time. I don't know if Richard ever did anything. I never heard from him again after that second call. I still have the documentation. The third case is shorter, but I include it because of how it ended, specifically because of what I found in the last 10 minutes before I left. A woman named Sandra hired me to locate her brother, who had stopped contacting the family. He was in his early 30s, a software engineer. No history of mental illness or substance use. He'd been, by Sandra's description, an extremely grounded person, skeptical, research-oriented, the kind of person who checks sources. He joined an organization called the Open Path Foundation about 14 months prior and had, over the following year, gradually reduced all contact with his family. Open Path presented publicly as a meditation and philosophy study group. The website was clean and thoughtful, testimonials from professionals, a reading list that included legitimate philosophers and cognitive scientists alongside some less credentialed material. Nothing on the surface that would alarm a skeptical engineer. That was, I came to understand, the entire point. I located the brother through a combination of public records and a property search connected to the organization's registered address. He was living in a group house, 6 people total, in a suburb I won't name. The house was on a quiet street. It looked lived in but orderly. I didn't approach. I confirmed he was physically present and appeared to be in good health. That was what Sandra needed to know legally. She'd been pursuing a welfare check and needed documentation. I photographed him leaving the house one morning, noted the timestamp, filed the report. That should have been the end of it, but I'd been working this case from a coffee shop near the group house on several mornings, and I had started noticing patterns without intending to. The house operated on a schedule. The residents left at the same time each morning, returned at the same time each evening, always in pairs or groups. Nobody came or went alone. I'd initially chalked this up to carpooling. They all presumably worked somewhere connected to the organization. On my last morning staking out the location, I noticed a car I recognized. I want to be precise. I recognized the make, model, and color, which was a specific combination. An older model, dark green sedan of a European brand that was uncommon in this region. I recognized it because I had photographed that exact car in front of the Meridian Circle's Victorian house, in the first case, 14 months earlier. I sat with this for a moment. Then I ran the plate. The plate came back to a leasing company, which told me nothing immediately. But the leasing company's address was a registered agent service. The same registered agent service in the same Delaware city as the Meridian Circle's business registration. I'm careful about coincidences. In 11 years, you learn that coincidences exist and that they also sometimes aren't coincidences. And the work is figuring out which. I had 2 organizations with no apparent public connection, different names, different cities, different membership demographics, different presentation styles, sharing a registered agent. A registered agent is just a bureaucratic point of contact. It doesn't mean the organizations are controlled by the same people, but it's a thread. I pulled the thread. I found 3 additional organizations in 3 different cities, all registered through variants of the same agent service, all operating in the high control group space. Different aesthetics. One was spiritual, one was professional development, one described itself as an intentional living community. Different target demographics, different price points, same thread running through all of them. I documented it. I filed my report to Sandra, including only the welfare information she'd asked for. I sent the additional documentation to a journalist I knew who covered nonprofit fraud. I haven't heard back, though it's been long enough that I've started to wonder if the message was received. That last morning, before I drove away from that quiet suburban street, I sat in my car for a few extra minutes. I was looking at my notes. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. A car pulled up across the street from the group house. Not the green sedan, a different car. A man got out and stood on the sidewalk, looking at the house for a moment before he went inside. He was dressed well, conservative but expensive, the kind of clothes Carol had worn in the way that cost money to look effortless. He was inside for about 40 minutes, then he came back out, got in the car, and drove away. I got the plate out of habit. When I ran it later, it came back to a leasing company. Different leasing company, different city, same registered agent. I drove home. I made a copy of everything and stored it somewhere that isn't my office. I told 2 people in my life, people I trust, what I found and where the copy was. Not because I thought something would happen to me. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling this story from a place of fear. I'm telling it because these organizations exist, they're connected, and the connections are findable if you know what you're looking for. But I do think about that man in the nice clothes sometimes. How he went inside that house in a quiet suburb and spent 40 minutes there and then left without acknowledging anyone on the street. How ordinary he looked. How completely unremarkable the whole scene was to anyone driving past. How long it would take you to notice that a pattern existed if no one was looking for it on your behalf. I think about the Harwick Society membership, men who run things, and I think about the green sedan, and I wonder who was in those rooms, across all those organizations, having their thinking gradually reoriented toward positions they didn't hold when they walked in. The journalist I sent the documentation to, I called twice and emailed once more after the initial message. The number is still active. Nobody has called back. What I keep coming back to is something the woman from the Harwick case said, that the reorientation felt from the inside, like finally thinking clearly. If that's what it felt like, if there were no fingerprints, no sense of intrusion, no moment where something felt wrong, how would you know it had happened to you?